All right, so tonight we have Brian Helmuth from Northeastern University, and he's going to share some of his research with us on blue mussels and how they're affected by climate change. And I told him that he has the most interesting background on any Zoom presentation I've been on. I feel like we're at the bottom of the sea right with him. So I'm going to hand it off to Brian.
Thanks, Suzanne. Yeah, actually, this is Aquarius. I've lived in that a couple times, and so I'm not going to talk about that tonight, but I'd be happy to come back and tell you about living under the ocean as well. I'm going to try to share my screen here, and we should be good to go. All right, so I want to start off tonight with a bit of a confession, and that is that I consider myself a reluctant climate scientist, and I never got into this field to be a climate scientist, to study climate change. Honestly, and I think my parents can vouch for this, it was the only job I could think of where somebody would pay me to scuba dive. And I had visions of being like Jacques Cousteau, living underwater, which I have done, traveling around the world and seeing images like this. And these are the kind of compelling images that I think really get us to care about the ocean, that get us excited about it. But more and more as I started studying the ocean, I would go back and see scenes like this. Oftentimes where there would be dead coral still in place, a bunch of very confused looking fish swimming around in almost like a ghost town. And then you go back a couple months later and it would look like a parking lot. And I started seeing this over and over and over again. We saw this in coral reefs, we saw this in intertidal zones, even in places where you wouldn't necessarily expect it. And it really drives home that climate change is not a future event. This is something that is impacting us now. And I think this story isn't that uncommon to a lot of us, that we certainly did not set out to study climate change because it was some magical source of funding, which it's not, for any other reason than everything we were studying started dying. As I got older, other things changed and had an even more important impact on me, and that's when I became a parent. And I really quickly realized that just studying the demise of ecosystems around the world wasn't enough. We had to do something about it. We had to recruit help to do it. And this is a problem that goes way beyond the scientific community. So I often get asked whether I'm optimistic about this. I mean, it's very easy to get depressed talking about climate change because we are talking about things that really look pretty dismal. I mean, as I'll talk about tonight, there are places around the globe right now that there is nothing we can do about them. But these are my reasons for optimism. I think this is why we have to keep pushing forward. So there are a couple things to realize in that context. And the first is that we're already committed to change. You can think about the climate system as almost like a giant ship that is steered way in advance of when it starts to turn. So if you've ever seen one of these giant tankers out at sea, the captain has to start turning miles in advance of before they want the ship to turn. And it's the same thing with climate. So as we're continuing to pump greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, the changes that are being driven by our actions today are not going to be felt for several years to decades to come. In other words, our children are paying the price for our folly. So that means that no matter what, we are committed to change. And oftentimes we talk about these interchangeably, but I think it's important to recognize that when we discuss mitigation, that is slowing down the worst impacts. That is trying to leave a better world for our kids and our grandkids. But we also have to adapt. I mean, we have to prepare society for the ongoing and projected impacts of climate change. As we were just talking about, last year was the warmest year on record. This year is already looking like it might beat that record. The hottest temperature recorded on the planet was just recorded last week. So we have to do both. And the best strategies have a mixture of mitigation and adaptation in it. So what research in my lab does, and I'll touch on a little bit of all three of these tonight, is we do what's called ecological forecasting. We ask when and where will climate change impact coastal organisms? We asked, what can we do about it, given our understanding of the science? And then how do we communicate solutions with non-scientists? We're very cognizant in the academic community that communicating to someone is never effective. This always has to, solutions have to be co-created. And especially as we move forward with discussions of environmental justice and Black Lives Matter, about hearing the voices of people who are traditionally underserved and unheard from, this really takes on new significance, that we really have to look at this as a partnership to find solutions. But the way I think about the research, the scientific research I do in my lab, is very much in the form of triage. And this is an idea that was communicated to me by a news reporter a long time ago. And he was trying to kind of get a handle on what it is we do. And he said, all right, it really sounds like you are medic on a and if anybody has ever served in the military or served as an EMT or in medicine, you know that there's this hard reality that when you come up in a mass casualty like this, there are patients that no matter what you do, they are going to die. And you make them comfortable and you do the best you can to ease their suffering. But if you are spending all of your time on those patients, you're potentially losing others. There are some who are green, who will be fine. Those are the ones that you prioritize last. And the ones that really, in some ways, have high priority are those that, with fast action, you can save. That these are the ones that you have a really good chance of saving if you prioritize that. That's really the point we're at now with climate change, with forecasting. There are places in the Caribbean now where the reefs are gone and there's nothing we're going to do to bring them back. We can focus our efforts on helping the people who depend on those for their survival to find other alternatives, but we're not going to bring the reefs back. Likewise, there are places that are doing pretty well. And these are the ones that can potentially serve as what we call refugia, which I'll talk about in a minute. So just as an example of how we can use this kind of triaging approach, imagine that we're a marine spatial planner where we are given funds to designate one site as a marine protected area, someplace that we hope will provide seed populations for fish that we care about, for endangered species. And they're all subject to stress from climate, stress from a whole host of other things like overfishing and trampling. But as we only have funding and the political will to designate these sites, how do we, based on the science, allocate funds? Well, the worst thing we could do would be, uh-oh, I hope you can hear me. I just got a message, my internet's unstable. If somebody give me a thumbs up if they hear me okay? Good. All right, excellent, thank you. The worst thing we could do would be to spend all of our money and political willpower on a site that is doing fine now, but 10 years down the road is going to die. Then we've thrown out our goodwill, we've thrown out good money after bad. We want to identify sites that are not only going to be healthy now, but will be healthy in the future, or as healthy as they can be to provide the seed populations. We give low priority to the sites where really there's nothing we can do. And intellectually, the most interesting sites are those where we may not be able to do anything about the local weather conditions, the local climate, but we can prevent other insults like sediment runoff and things like harvesting that we know put populations really close to the edge, where climate change then serves as the kind of coup de grace. And so oftentimes, even though we're looking at ameliorating climate change impacts, we're talking about doing things that have nothing to do with climate change. So this is kind of a really broad brushstroke overview of the kind of stuff we do with ecological forecasting, where we take weather data and forecasts, we downscale them into the level of organisms. We ask, how does that impact the physiology and the ecology of things we care about? We scale back up to large-scale ecological and societal impacts, and then we run what-if scenarios. We say, well, what if we have a global climate of this versus this different scenarios? What can we expect under those conditions? So the way we view this in the biological community in some ways is very similar to how we view vulnerability of human populations, where we can break these things into three categories. The first is exposure. So for example, if we're looking at the impacts of heat wave on an urban population, we look at how exposure changes from place to place. Sort of urban effects, that means that one hotter than another one. We look at exposure to storms. We look at sensitivity to that exposure. Like many things, we know that oftentimes the people who are most vulnerable are those who have other health issues, those who are elderly. It's the thing with non-human organisms, those are already physiologically compromised, or those that are likely to die. And then adaptive capacity, which in human terms usually ends up equating to resources, to proactively prepare for and recover from these extreme events. But we also see that in non-human organisms. And why this is the case, one of the things we know is that climate change produces winners and losers among species. Now, the things that are winners from their perspective are often species we don't like. There are already things that can live over a wide range of environmental conditions. Kudzu's a great example of a winner. Mosquitoes love climate change. Lionfish are kind of moving up the east coast of North America right now and eating the larval fish of other species. And then the losers are those who usually are very restricted in their geographic scope. So these are endemic species. These are species that are only found in one place in the wild. And so when that one location is wiped out, they're gone. And so really what we're doing is we're making the world a better place for these generalists that often tend to be invasive and we don't like. And we understand the basis of that. We understand the physiological sensitivity, and humans have known this for thousands and tens of thousands of years. You can look at any graph like this one from a USDA report looking at the different optimal temperature for growth and for reproduction amongst a series of crops. And farmers have known this for a very long time. They know what crops grow best in their climatic area. And for a long time, that works based on historical precedent. But if anybody here is a gardener and has looked at the USDA growing maps, you'll see that already those are shifting. The plants that did well in your garden 10, 20, no longer are doing so well because it's getting too warm. And so we know this for a wide variety of species. And it's one of the reasons why we focus so much on temperature. We know that many animals and plants live close to the limits of their tolerances to temperature. Slight increases in temperature literally can cause animals to cook. If anybody's ever made ceviche before, where you put fish in lime juice, essentially you're doing the same thing as cooking. You're just making all those proteins fly apart and denature using acid instead of heat. During a heat wave, animals exposed to high temperatures literally are cooking out in the environment. And we know that enzyme function is all strongly temperature dependent. And so we can construct what's called a thermal performance curve for virtually every organism on the planet, where we know there's a range of temperatures over which they can survive, where there's a lower lethal limit below which they die. It gets too cold, their enzymes stop functioning, and an upper lethal limit above which they die. What we often don't recognize, though, is there's also this kind of gray area where there's a narrow range of temperatures over which they do extremely well, but also much wider range, especially here below suboptimal, where they're able to hang on, but they're not reproducing. They're not doing very well ecologically. These describe almost any species, but the difference between this minimum temperature and maximum temperature, or between optimal and lethal, changes from species to species. So on coral reefs, for example, the algae, the zooxanthellae that live in those tissues, die at temperatures that are degrees above what their optimum is. So even small changes in temperature can lead to rapid changes in performance and even death. So one example of this is looking at a graphic that shows the changes in lobster catch in our part of the world from 1967 to 2014. So you start back in 1967, look at the purple as it's moving up the coast, where there are places now in Long Island that following a high temperature event and low oxygen event, the lobster fishery has collapsed. In contrast, if you look in especially the northern Gulf of Maine, it increased over 200% a few years ago as it warmed to this optimal condition, but already we're starting to, or we're expecting to see this decline very soon as we move from this optimal into this almost lethal condition. So this is one of the hard things to communicate, is that sometimes species seem to be doing pretty well and even a little bit better as they get just a little bit warmer, but we know that precedes a sudden decline in their survival. Another thing we know, but we're, as scientists, often really bad at communicating, is that climate change is a very uniform process. So this graph shows changes in the surface temperature over the surface of the globe. There are places that are getting colder. Here in the North Atlantic, it's a couple degrees colder than it was 50 years ago. There are places in the high Arctic that are 9 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than they are even 50 years ago. And there are places that are even staying the same. But the point is that the vast majority of sites on the planet are getting warmer. And when a climatologist talks about this, they're thinking of the kind of total heat content of the globe. They're averaging this all together. So we talk about this as if it's a 1 degree increase in average surface temperature, which it is, and that's very meaningful to a climatologist, but it's not terribly meaningful to the rest of us in daily life. So just as an example, the difference between now and the last ice age is about 6 degrees in average global surface temperature. So when we're talking about the potential for an increase of 6 degrees by the end of the century, that's the same magnitude of the difference between now and an ice age, only in the opposite direction. So the way we think about this then is that climate trains the weather, but weather throws the punches. So if anybody remembers the movie Rocky, ultimately it is the trainer that trains the boxer, but at that moment in the ring, you don't care about the trainer, you care about that left hook landing on your jaw. And it's the same thing with climate change. We really don't perceive climate. Climate is a 30-year plus trend in weather. No organism does. Populations and species do, but for any organism, including humans, we're experiencing weather, and how climate is manifest as these changing weather conditions. And that's really hard to detect sometimes because we're so cued into our local conditions. So right now, here in Boston, it's pretty cool. I mean, it's about 69 degrees Fahrenheit, but they're in the midst of a heat wave on the West Coast. Not too long ago, we were in the midst of a heat wave as well. So climate change means that there's heat being moved across the planet in some counterintuitive ways. And it means that you can never judge what's going on just by one location. You really have to start putting this together in a systematic way. So ultimately, what we do is we try to figure out how organisms experience that weather in terms of how it drives their body temperatures, because that's really what defines their physiology. And this is where it gets a little strange to think about from a non-human perspective, because we're so trained to think about how weather affects us. We're endotherms. We have our own internal heat source. If our body temperatures change by as little as 4 or 5 degrees, we can either have hypothermia if we get too cold, or hyperthermia if we have a fever for too long. But for the vast majority of organisms on the planet, they have a very different view of their world. And that's what I want to spend the rest of this talk looking at, is how do we get around this very anthropocentric view of the world, this human bias, because we do have a fundamentally different way of seeing weather and climate in our environments that is really fundamentally different than the way most organisms experience the world, and that really can bias our perception of risk and of where trouble spots are with that triaging. So just as an analogy to that, there's another example of when information is there, but we're just not equipped to see it. So if anybody who is non-colorblind and is sighted is looking at a flower here on the left with yellow, it's pretty, it's nice, but it really doesn't have any information in it. On the right is a false color image of how a bee or a hummingbird would see that same flower. Instead of it being this all uniform yellow color, now we start seeing things like bullseyes and runways, things that are conveying a lot of information to a pollinator. All that information is entering our eyes, that ultraviolet radiation is entering our eyes just as it does an insect, but we're not equipped to process it. We're not doing anything with that information. We have to convert it to something that we can comprehend. So in this case, it's a false color image that gives the equivalent of what we would see in the visible spectrum. We can use science to make those false color images. We can look at what the wavelengths of light are that different species of organisms perceive, what their sensitivity is to that, and that's what we can use to make those images. And we can use technology. The same thing happens with temperature. And the vast majority of organisms on Earth are ectothermic. They don't have this internal heat source, which means that their body temperatures are changing with the temperature of their environment. This is where things really start to go astray from our perspectives as humans. So if we turn out a weather forecast, the first thing you're going to look at is what? It's going to be air temperature and then probably the chance of rain and maybe the humidity. When I moved to South Carolina, I learned of this awful thing called the heat index, which is a combined influence of relative humidity and air temperature on what your body perceives. And under really high humidity, as anybody in the South knows, you no longer are able to cool yourself by sweating. It makes you feel like you're that much hotter. Here in the Northeast, it's exactly the opposite with wind chill, where the combined influence of air temperature and wind speed sucks the heat from your body faster via convection. And so we say that the air feels colder than it is simply because we're then considering the role of convection. But for non-humans and non-mammalian, non-endotherm species, all these other mechanisms of heat exchange have a huge impact on their body temperature. And it's in ways that are much more complicated than just thinking about air temperature. So if anybody's had a pet lizard before, I had a pet iguana growing up, you get them a hot rock or you get them a heat lamp. That's because the dominant source of heat for them is either directly from solar radiation, from sunlight, or they're picking up that heat from a rock that in nature would have been heated by the sun. And so all these mechanisms of heat exchange are affecting us too. We just don't tend to think of them as driving our body temperature because we compensate for this. So if you put a hot iron or a poker in a fire and you leave it in there long enough, that heat will conduct up your hand. If you put your hands over fire, you'll feel convection, there's radiation. One of the most counterintuitive ways is through infrared radiation. So if anybody here is an amateur, one of the cool things is that if you look at the color of a star, if you look at a yellow star versus a red star versus a blue star, it tells you something about the temperature of that star. The wavelength of light that it emits is dependent on the temperature of its surface. And so astronomers are able to use things like the Hubble telescope to determine what the temperature of a planet or a sun is, by looking at the wavelengths that it emits, because that relates to its temperature. Turns out that that applies to all objects in the universe above absolute zero. So when we're looking at something like a star, the changes in wavelengths are in that spectrum that we can see, that short wavelength. In the biological spectrum, is red wavelengths. So this is the way a pit viper would see an image on the right. We can use an infrared camera to measure the same thing. And just like that hummingbird picture, we can make these false color images. So in this example of a sea star feeding on mussels, you've got the mussel that's there at about 20, 22 degrees, the predator sitting there, it's about 11 degrees, and air temperature is probably somewhere in the middle. So what this means is it's really hard to determine where trouble spots are if we only take this human perspective. We have to somehow take off the blinders as humans and look at the world through this organism we care about. Even if we look at endotherms, organisms like us, and if this talk was in person, I would be shining an infrared camera on the audience and showing this to you, but instead I'll show you this picture of a koala bear that I took in the Sydney Zoo. We can look at the temperature over the koala's surface, where his eyes, his ears, his inner thighs are much, much hotter, or they're releasing a lot more heat energy than is his fur, which is trapping in that heat energy. On the right is also in Australia, and this shows some limpets and snails that are in a very modest crevice, only about a 30-degree crevice, but those facing the sun are about 45 degrees. Those facing away from the sun are down about 25 degrees. And the temperature that they're at also depends on things like their shape and their color. So this is how a non-human organism experiences the world and how they experience climate change. And all organisms have this unique way of experiencing the world. So climate, these long-term trends in weather is changing, but it's weather that impacts organisms. And two organisms exposed to identical environmental conditions can have very, very different body temperatures. And this is what matters, because it's body temperature, not air temperature, that drives their physiology and ultimately whether they live or die. So we study this in the intertidal zone. It's long been this model system for looking at the impacts of changing weather conditions on survival. These are marine organisms that evolved in the marine environment, but they further evolved to live exposed to air on a daily basis during every low tide. If anybody's, I'm sure all of you have been to the seashore at some point, you've seen zonation, where you see the replacement of one species by another one. Where we're low in the intertidal, these plants and animals are spending more time in water than they are in air. You move farther and farther up the shore to places where you only find barnacles, where they're spending more time in air than they are in water. And so in many ways, this is an early warning system for the impacts of climate change, because although these organisms have evolved to deal with incredibly harsh conditions, they're already living about as far up in the intertidal as they can. And so any increased stress in temperature desiccation stress will start pushing them back down again. So we do this in a couple different ways. I won't walk you through all this, but we have what are called heat budget models, where we can keep track of the amount of heat energy that enters something like a sea star or a mussel or a barnacle. We can look at how much that heat is stored by the plant or the animal. And by keeping track of this heat gain and loss, we can estimate the body temperature as a function of weather conditions. And so really what we end up doing is we make weather forecasts for marine organisms. We've gotten pretty good at that. We've gotten to where we can predict the maximum temperature in any given month to within about a degree or two, even though these temperatures are changing by 20, 25 degrees over the course of a day. The other way we can do it is we can build robots. So the upper left, these started being called Robo-Mussel by a writer from Discover magazine, who, as you can guess, was writing this about the same time that Wall-E came out, where we match the characteristics of the instrument to those of the animal we care about. So if you think about that picture I showed you with the infrared the infrared image showing the temperatures of the sea star and the mussels. The color of the sea star and the mussel, the shape, how much it weighed, all affect how much heat it's able to gain surrounding environment. So what we found is if we don't modify these temperature loggers, we can get errors of upwards of 14 degrees C as they're sitting out in the sun. If we match them, we can get to within about 2 degrees, which again is not that bad considering how much they're changing. We've worked with a number of different partners. Most recently, we've been working with a group in Portugal that has made this tiny logger that is about the size of a dime that can fit in a limpet. We're trying to deploy these around the world, and our goal is to hopefully have a citizen science network who can download these on their cell phones and keep track of temperatures up and down the coast of the world's oceans. We've experimented with some that talk to each other, but still at this point, a lot of this is just brute force effort, going out and putting these things in the intertidal and going back and retrieving them. But we've done this at upwards of 71 sites worldwide, beginning in 1998. So we have these extensive records, places in California, for example, where we have every 10 minutes of temperature going back to 1998. We've been expanding this through a global network. It's not shown in this picture, but we've started putting them in Southeast Asia, in China and Malaysia as well. And what these show is that in many cases, most of these animals, or many of these, are living much, much closer to their tolerance limits than we ever would have guessed based on air temperature. So we're regularly, even in the Gulf of Maine, seeing temperatures of 30, 35, even 40 degrees Fahrenheit, well over 100 degrees, because of this combined influence of the sun and air temperature. And so when we compare that to what we know their physiological limits are, we know that they are very close to dying. And in fact, we see a lot of mortality, and we really think that's contributed to the decline of mussels in the Gulf of Maine. What it also shows us is that our ideas of where to look for climate change impacts are a lot more complex than we thought. Now, the typical kind of textbook way of looking for impacts would be at the equatorial range edge of a species distribution, where we think that, you know, they go in the northern hemisphere, they go as far south as they possibly can. But what we find over and over again, and this has been shown on many continents now, is that for many animals, they're exhibiting what we're thinking of as a mosaic, where you move up and down the coast, and you have sites that get hot, sites that get cold. So if you think of the risky spots in terms of the triaging as those that are the highest, those are interspersed with those that are relatively cool, and the relatively cool ones are those stepping stones or those refugia that we might want to protect. None of this is detectable based on our human perceptions of weather and climate. So for example, in Southern California, certainly air temperatures are hotter than they are in, but because of the dynamics of the tide, most of the low tides in summer occur in the middle of the night or early in the morning in Southern California, and they're occurring right in the middle of the day in Central Oregon. So even during the hottest times of the day in Southern California, the animals are underwater. And we've seen this for other systems as well. It's not just driven by tides, but because of those very local characteristics. So why this matters is that these impacts may be occurring in really unexpected locations. And if we only look at these range edges, we're likely missing a lot. And in fact, we are seeing die-off events well within these range boundaries that otherwise have gone undetected. We know now that many animals are living much closer to the lethal limits than we ever would have predicted based only on air temperature. And then the final part, and what I want to wrap up with here, is that we can use this understanding to identify what we call climate refugia, places where animals and plants can survive during extreme events, things like heat waves and cold snaps, and then reproduce to repopulate surrounding areas. So this is an idea that's been around for a while, but typically it's been thought of in evolutionary timescales, where, for example, if we have a retreat of glaciers, there are deep snowdrifts that provide insulation that things like large ungulates can take advantage of. And so populations can override evolutionary short periods of time. We're thinking hundreds of years to thousands of years by living in those. But what conservation biologists have started thinking about was, well, can we do this in real time? Can we look at this in real time to detect places that we should save. So what our question, our scientific question is how does this change with the perspective of the animal? So we spend a lot of time mapping out things like temperature in coastal zones, and we can find that if anybody's gone swimming in an area where there's been a lot of sun and not a lot of water exchange, you know that the surface waters get warmer, and in summer here in New England, there are days when it feels hotter than other days, and that's because the sun has heated the surface water. A whale swimming through that is really not going to respond to it. If it doesn't like where it is, it can get to a brand new temperature in a matter of a couple of seconds because it's so large. But for a lot of these animals, things like a snail, the difference in temperature between one spot and another and 3 feet away is a huge difference. So this is a reconstruction. This is actually based on an actual photograph, and it's a snail's eye view of the world. Those white blobs you're seeing there are actually barnacles or barnacle tests. And this is an image we've recreated of what it would look like for a snail to climb just from one side of a rock to another one. This isn't a really huge rock. It's about 3 feet. I like this part. This is where he starts looking down the other side of that ski slope to hell on the other side. But if you think about it, in the same way that mountain pass can serve as a refugium for a big ungulate, it could be that these really teeny tiny crevices do the equivalent for something like a little snail or a mussel or a sea star, where all they have to do is make it to one of these little shaded areas to ride out a heat wave, and then can come back out following the heat wave. So in some ways, it really is just a matter of scale. We have to think about what the scale in the environment is relative to what that organism experiences. And again, this is something, looking at a rock, we would never think twice about. So what we do is we take images using usually drones. We also take pictures on the shore. We have colleagues who are experimenting with using fixed wing aircraft to look at larger sections of coastline. We create 3D models, and then we put these into these heat engineering thermal modeling approaches. So this is just a reconstruction of a site at Nahant, where we've flown a drone in a number of directions, and then we can manipulate this to look at it from any viewpoint. And the cameras are good enough now that even from a pretty reasonably priced drone, $1,000 drone, we can get down to the level of centimeters. And what we can do then is we can reconstruct what those temperatures are. We can make a digital elevation model. So this just shows that the elevation of a site. We can put that into a heat budget model. So what this shows are the temperature. The sections that are missing are because they're underwater. And as the tide rolls out, you see things get hotter. And then as the afternoon progresses, it gets colder and colder. We can then combine that with this physiological information to look at performance over the course of a day. But ultimately here, and I'm sure this is going through the heads of at least some of you, it should be, we really don't care about whether Barnacle lives and Sally the Barnacle dies over here. And we're never proposing that we need to understand that level of detail. What we care about is putting it together at a whole site level. So what we can do is we can start looking at entire sites to look at its potential to serve as a refugium. So in this case, this looks at the reproductive output of a population of mussels at one location in terms of number of eggs. Once we take the approach, now we can play these games of, under current weather conditions, under future weather conditions, what's the potential for this site to serve as a population. I apologize, these slides are out of order. To repopulate using rescue sites. It's called a meta-community framework, and really all that means is that under benign conditions, all these sites are fine, and animals are able to grow and populate all these sites. But during extreme events, places that don't have these microrefugia are those that get burned off. And it's only those that have the microrefugia that, once the extreme event is passed, allow the repopulation of those areas. And so this is, in green here, is an example of a refugium that we would use. And so what we are doing with this in terms of next steps is we're trying to make global maps of how to prioritize areas. And we're also looking at how we potentially can enhance gray infrastructure like seawalls. Especially in places here like Boston, there's an awful lot of coastal area that is already covered by concrete. And realistically, while we would love to use green infrastructure and replace those with things like marshes, we know that that's not going to happen. And so at least as an intermediary step, what we could do is we potentially can retrofit some of these seawalls by increasing their complexity. This is an example of a group we work with in Singapore. There's another one in the UK, another in Australia, that is looking at how we can take this kind of refugium approach to at least make the best of a bad situation, where if we've already covered over an intertidal area, can we at least make it amenable to a wider range of biodiversity. So the take homes of this then are, we already know climate change is having these significant impacts. We know these play out as these shorter term weather events. We know that impacts vary from location to location, from species to species, and that non-human organisms experience the world and climate change very differently than we do. But if we can use this, this biophysical approach to kind of move away from anthropocentric thinking, even if our ultimate goal is to understand how non-human organisms affect our well-being, we can predict some of these impacts, and it shows things, it shows patterns that otherwise would be invisible to us. So I'm going to stop there, just acknowledge the rest of my lab. My email is there. If you have any questions you think of after this, feel free to email me. My Twitter account is there, and my lab is there. But I'll stop, and I'm happy to take any questions that any of you have.
Thanks, Brian. And just a reminder that we're using the chat box for questions. So go ahead and type questions in there, and Brian will see them and address them.
No questions? Come on, it cannot have been perfectly clear. You guys are all being so shy.
Well, Brian, while we're waiting for folks to type,
there you go.
I'm curious, you talked about anthropocentric views, and I wonder, your approach to this research, has it been having effects on empathy for these creatures, looking at them through that lens versus a human lens?
That's a fantastic question, and I promise I didn't prompt Suzanne to say that. So one of the other projects I have going on is with a cognitive psychologist on campus named John Coley. And we're looking at how we can use architectural design and artwork to communicate ideas of environmental stewardship by enhancing empathy, by getting people to perceive their environment not only as non-human organisms, but also to get them to understand how that environment is affecting them. And so is one example. We have here in Boston, it's called the Emerald Necklace, and it was a series of parks that were designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, the same person who designed Central Park in New York. And it's really fallen into disarray in a lot of parts of the city, but there are efforts now to try to renovate it. And so one of the things we're trying to do is work with local communities to find out, what is it that they value about that environment? How can we help them to communicate what they value, not as scientists, but how do we find new ways of providing voice to local residents for exactly that reason, to look at building empathy. So one of my favorite quotes is again, Jacques Cousteau, as we protect what we love. Okay, thank you, Heidi. So what actions can we take to raise awareness about this research, and how is it funded? So those in some ways are two really different questions. The second one, how is it funded, is always one of the trickiest. So I have been lucky to have been funded by the National Science Foundation, NASA, NOAA, but funding has gotten incredibly competitive, especially for anything to do with climate change in recent years. And so the average funding rate is about 5%. And so for every 20 proposals we submit, and usually we can submit maybe 4 or 5 a year, we expect to get one funded. And so, as I said, I've been very fortunate. Usually what we're doing is we are piecing together different sources of funding as best we can to do double duty. That spills over into the other part of your question about raising awareness, because while we're trying to do this cutting edge research, especially here at Northeastern, one of the reasons why I came here is that we are all hired because we do use-inspired research. We really try to take that research, and even though it's cutting edge, really our ultimate goal is to figure out how to implement it in the community. And that's really hard to get funded, any kind of community-led project. And so typically what we'll do is we'll get the science funded, and then by hook or by crook, we will try to use it to raise awareness. So to really answer that question, in my view, the best way to raise awareness is to co-create mechanisms for communication, to enable voices that aren't heard. Sorry, since nobody else is chiming in, I'm gonna take my prerogative here. If you give me 1 minute, I will share a lab website, because I think this is a great example of what I'm talking about. All right, so this is our lab website. If you are interested and you go under research and go to virtual tours, these are virtual reality tours, some in video, some in still images of all the places we work around the world. One of my favorite ones, though, was created by a program that we run jointly with our outreach program called Beach Sisters. And if anybody knows the program Girls Inc., there's a Girls Inc. of Lynn. Girls Inc. serves underserved communities, typically environmental justice communities, where they train young women to be mentors to younger women. And what Beach Sisters does is they train them to be leaders in environmental issues. So what we have done is we make what we think of are these kind of palettes, where they're these high resolution images that you can zoom into the level of a snail. And then we cut loose the students and say, go out into the field and take pictures, write stories, make videos, take your cell phones out there, and then we'll help you to tell the story. And so this is one that was done by the Beach Sisters in a marsh near our marine lab. And what they'll then do is they'll use this to teach their parents, to teach their mentees. And what I think is most exciting is we've gotten students from different countries to communicate with one another. So we've gotten groups in France and Israel to communicate with some of these young women. And we've done similar things with groups in China, but the problem is with the time difference, we haven't been able to get them together live. But it's this kind of thing that I think is the way to raise awareness, is to not to presume that we know the way to tell the story or even what's most important, but just help to provide those tools to people living in those communities. So that's a really long-winded answer, but I got really excited about that question. So thanks for queuing me up, Heidi. Anybody else?
And if by chance there's someone out there with a question but can't figure out the chat box, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask it. That's okay too. We have a relatively small group.
All right, well, if anybody thinks of any questions, I'm happy, I mean, contact me over email or social media. I'm happy to chat some more about any of this stuff.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. This is fun.
And thanks everyone for joining us this evening. Check out the Wells Reserve's website for future programs.
Have a good night.
Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.